2 years ago that I listened to preliminary reports coming out of Canada on their national report around their missing and murdered Indigenous women. And while they had begun to look for this information and collect the data, they found that there were a lot of errors, there were a lot of roadblocks in the way, and perhaps some of the initial data that they collected was not clear or didn't really reflect the number of women that had gone either missing or murdered. It was at that time also that a young woman up in Fargo went missing, Savannah Graywin. She was a young woman, pregnant. She was missing for a day or so, only to find her body without her unborn child in her womb in the river. And they later were able to find that child with a neighbor that had committed the crime. And so then there was the legislator from North Dakota that started a Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women bill to study the situation in North Dakota, Heidi-Heiskamp. And I thought to myself, you know, why is Canada doing this and Minnesota, or the United States isn't doing this? Why is North Dakota doing this and Minnesota is not doing that? And then I had to remind myself, I am a state legislator and this is what I do. And so I came to the Capitol in the middle of the summer and spoke with House Research and said, we really need to do something around this. And they were able to put together like a first rough version of this bill. At that time, I reached out to the indigenous community, to the different organizations, to individuals that I knew in the Native American community across the state, and invited them to come in and sit around a table and look at the bill and tell me, what do you want this bill to look like? I wanted them to really be the creators of this bill. On the night that we had about 18 very passionate women around the table. We had at least a dozen folks from greater Minnesota on the phone. And we went through the bill line by line, piece by piece, and fine-tuned that bill. And that was the bill that I presented last year to the state legislature. That was House File 3375. Fortunately, we were able to hear that in, before the first deadline. It was actually the last committee hearing, the last hearing of the day before the deadline loomed. And it was an incredibly emotional, compassionate hearing. And what I think it did, it opened up the hearts and the eyes and the understanding that this is a national endemic, that this is a tragedy that has happened through historic times, and it hasn't gotten the attention or the compassion that it should have gotten over all of these times. And through this, I can tell you as a legislator, I have grown incredibly. The stories that I hear from women, from family members about not only themselves, but their sister, their mother, their grandmother, their aunt, is really, really heartbreaking. But I think it's really important that at this state legislature, at the Minnesota legislature, that we hear these stories and we listen very carefully, just as we listened to the testimony of the hearing before this one. Because these are human beings, these are women, these are life bearers, these are our ancestors. And we don't want to forget them. We want to be able to give them an opportunity to be heard and to ask for recognition, and then to ask for help in finding ways to end this whole tragic situation. So this task force that we have, I have here in front of you, House File 70, also 111 as a clone, creates a task force to address the violence against Indigenous women, and it defines the standards and requirements for this task force. It will create a task force to examine and report on issues addressing the systemic causes behind violence against Indigenous women, and that also naturally will extend to girls, to our Two-Spirit, and to men as well. We will ask them to recommend appropriate methods for tracking and collecting the data. We We will ask this task force to act as a liaison between government agencies, policies, and institutions that impact violence against Indigenous women. And again, by natural progress, I'm sure it will be against, the issues against all women, men, violence against anyone. We are also asking them to recommend appropriate measures to address the violence and assist the victims and their families. This task force will be compiled of 17 individuals that will include law enforcement, defense attorneys, prosecutors, judges, tribal governments, non-government agencies, especially those who work with Indigenous communities, as well as the victims and the families of our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And of course, we have in the past had the support of all 11 tribes in Minnesota, and we would ask for their continued participation in that. This task force will be required to report to the legislature by December 15th of 2020. And the fiscal note that has been connected to this would allot $67,000 for the first year for the compilation of the connecting of this task force, as well as some of the data collection. And then in year two, it would be $33,000 for a total of $100,000. In your packet here, you should have a report. It's called The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, a snapshot of data from 71 urban cities in the United States. This is the first real comprehensive collection of data that I have seen yet in the last 2 years. And this was put together by the Urban Indian Health Institute in Seattle with the help of a young woman who is passionate and devoted to studying the missing and murdered Indigenous women. Her name is Anita Lakeshi, and she deserves a lot of the kudos for putting this together. I won't go through this, but I would really ask that you, on your own time, would take this and look through it and read it and try to understand what has been going on in our Indigenous communities for hundreds of years. You will find that one of the sad facts of the matter is that Minnesota ranks number 9 out of the top 10 states for the most missing and murdered Indigenous women. And for me, it's a crying shame no matter what. So I want to share this with you, ask you to read it, help you understand it. I know that we will hopefully be moving on to other committees to have this heard. But it's really important that not only are we educating ourselves, but that we are educating our constituents and the rest of the states. Hopefully this is something that, and I know it is a movement that is growing across the United States as well as up in Alaska. And so I would ask you to help us educate our communities and our state around this very, very sad tragedy. I have brought with me a few women that would like to testify and tell their stories. Some of these women work with the Indigenous community around this kind of violence. We have victims of this crime who were personally abducted and violated. We also have the family of a young woman named Jojo Boswell. Her mother and her daughter and her mother and her sister are here with us today. They lost their daughter and their sister Jojo, 2005 it was, never to be heard of again. They don't know what happened. They know where she was seen last, and that's all they know. And this is what they've had to live with, day in and day out. And I'd like to invite them in a minute to share their story as well. To the right of me, I have Nicole Matthews. She is from Minnesota Indian Sexual Assault Coalition. I would like you to please share what you have to say today.
Let me just pause very quickly to acknowledge the presence of Representative Aisha Williams, who's joined us. She's not a member of this committee, but she's asked us to participate with us, and so welcome. Gomez. want to acknowledge the presence of Senator Kunesh-Podein today. He's also stopped by to sit in and to listen, and also to honor the stories of what they shared. So welcome. Oh, and Representative Assad. I couldn't see you past the. Welcome to Representative actually it's Ms. Matthews. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bonjour, Tenoe Magana, Nicole Matthews, Jaganashima, Mary Kunesh-Podein, Greetings, my relatives. My English name is Nicole Matthews, and my Indian name is Coleman. I'm Eagle Clan, and I'm from the Warrior Clan of Ojibwe. I'm truly honored to have the opportunity to speak with you today about murdered and missing Indigenous women. I am the Executive Director of the Minnesota Indian Women Sexual Assault Coalition, which is a statewide tribal coalition and a national tribal technical assistance provider. Our coalition membership spans the entire state and includes individual and organizational representatives from all tribal communities and includes urban representation as well. In addition, we provide technical assistance to tribes and community organizations across the country who are addressing both sexual violence and sex trafficking. I was one of 5 interviewers for our research on prostitution and trafficking of American Indian and Alaska Native women in Minnesota, where we interviewed 105 of our Native sisters about their experiences being used in prostitution and trafficking. One of the things that we heard from many of the women we interviewed was that they knew of someone who had been trafficked and they had never seen nor heard from them again. We heard story after story of the violence and invisibility they encountered on a daily basis. In fact, one woman told us that a sex buyer told her, "I thought we killed all of you." This is the same violence and invisibility that many of us encounter on a daily basis. We are indigenous to this land, and we deserve better. Thanks to a report that was recently published, that Representative Kunesh-Podein mentioned, we are starting to see data on the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women. We know, however, that there is more data out there, and all of the data represents real human life. Someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's auntie, and someone's friend. We have many stories. In 2016, we lost Rose Downwind, who was missing and later found murdered by her partner. That same year, we also lost Tanya Skinaway Sam, who was also murdered by her partner. And last year, on this very day, January 29th, 2018, we lost a sister, Lene Strong, who was murdered here in St. Paul. There are many more stories similar to the ones I've mentioned, and some that you will hear today. And there are many, many more stories that are yet to be told. Stories that we don't hear in the media. Stories from our Indigenous trans sisters that don't get lifted up. Stories that have been forgotten or deemed unimportant. These stories are not just numbers for us. They represent a loss to our community and to our families. And it is time for Minnesota to acknowledge the responsibility to the Indigenous women on whose land we sit today. Minnesota has long been a leader on issues of gender-based violence, and creating a task force to address murdered and missing Indigenous women is a great way to continue that legacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms.